You ever feel a silence so loud it screams? That's what Lena Bishop heard every single day. For 6 months since they put what was left of her husband Frank into the red Arizona dirt, the silence had been her only companion. The sun baked the land, the flies buzzed over nothing, and the only sound was the lonely creak of her porch swing, counting down the seconds of her life. She thought that silence was the worst thing in the world. She was wrong, because one day a new sound came, the soft thud of horse hooves in the dust, and the silence was broken by a shadow that fell over her entire world. He wasn't a man. He was a mountain carved from sinew and stone, sitting on a paint horse that looked like a child's toy beneath him. He was an Apache, the kind of man they told stories about to scare children, the kind of man she blamed for her husband's grave. His name was Nachok. He didn't say anything at first. He just looked at her, his eyes like polished obsidian, drinking in her despair, her loneliness, her patched-up dress, and her failing homestead. He saw it all. And when he finally spoke, his voice was the low rumble of thunder on a distant horizon, a promise of a storm she could never survive. He looked right through her, right into the empty space where her future was supposed to be, and he made a vow that was a brand on the stillness, a prophecy that would shatter her world. "By winter," the giant said, each word a hammer blow, "you'll have my son growing inside you." Lena's world shrank to the space between one ragged breath and the next. Frank's old Winchester shotgun was just inside the door. She could picture it, feel the weight of it in her hands. But it felt a world away, a continent away. Her hand, resting on the splintered porch rail, trembled so hard she had to grip the wood to keep from falling. He was magnificent and terrifying, taller than any man she'd ever seen, with shoulders that strained the seams of his deerskin vest. His face was a mask of hard angles and sun-baked copper, framed by two long, thick braids of hair so black it seemed to drink the light. A single eagle feather, stark and white, was tied at the end of one braid. But it was his eyes that held her captive. They weren't filled with the wild, unthinking hate she'd been taught to expect. No, this was worse. They were intelligent, ancient, and held a chilling certainty that went bone deep. Behind him, a dozen more warriors sat on their horses, silent, stoic. Their presence was a suffocating weight on the already oppressive air. They were ghosts from the stories whispered in town, the specters that haunted the dreams of every isolated homesteader. The very men she believed had made her a widow. "What?" she stammered, the word barely a whisper stolen by the dry wind. "What did you say?" Nachok dismounted in a single fluid motion. He moved with a predator's grace that made his immense size seem even more impossible. Every step he took toward her porch was deliberate, a drumbeat marking the end of her life as she knew it. He stopped at the bottom step, forcing her to look down at him. A position of power he made her feel with every fiber of her being. "My brother Taza died on this land," he said. His English was clipped, heavy with an accent she couldn't place, but each word was as clear as a funeral bell. "Your husband's rifle fired the shot." He let that hang in the air. The accusation, the sentence. "A life for a life," he continued, his gaze dropping to her flat belly. "A bloodline for a bloodline. His spirit wanders unavenged. It will not be settled with your death. Death is too simple." His eyes came back to hers, and they burned with a cold, righteous fire. "It will be settled with life. My life, joined with yours." His gesture toward her stomach was so intimate, so possessive, it made her skin crawl with a violation that was already happening. His blood was spilled into this dust. "My blood will be planted in you. A new life will grow. A son. By winter you will carry him. This is our way. This is justice." Tears of pure rage and terror burned her eyes, turning the red dust to mud on her cheeks. "You murdering savage," she spat, the words tearing from her throat. "You killed my Frank. You rode down on him and left him for the coyotes. And now you dare!" She choked on her own fury, unable to form the words for the nightmare he was promising. A flicker of something crossed his face. Was it surprise? Contempt? "Your husband was not alone," Nachok said, the words cutting through her tirade. "He met us with fire. We answered. Now the debt is owed." That was the first crack in her reality. Not alone. His gaze swept over her small, struggling homestead. The parched corn stalks, the leaky water barrel, the sagging porch roof. It was a testament to her failure, her inability to hold back the wilderness Frank had tried to tame. Nachok's eyes seemed to see it all, to see the desperation she tried so hard to hide when she rode into town for supplies. "You are alone," he stated, not as a question, but as a fact. "This land is dying. You are dying with it. You have nothing." "I have my honor," she cried, finding a sliver of Frank's stubborn pride within her. "And I'll die before I let a heathen like you touch me." He took a single step up, and she recoiled as if he'd struck her. He was so close now she could smell him, horse and leather and something else, something wild and clean like pine needles after a rain. His shadow engulfed her completely, stealing the last of the sun. "Dying is easy," he murmured, his voice dropping to a near whisper that was more menacing than any shout. "Living is the challenge. You will live, and you will be the mother of my son." He turned then, without another word, and swung himself back onto his horse. She thought they would leave. She prayed they would leave, but they didn't. He and his warriors moved to the small creek that bordered her property, the thin ribbon of life that was the only reason the homestead existed at all, and they began to make camp. Lena stood frozen on the porch, his words echoing in the vast, terrible silence. "By winter, you'll have my son growing inside you." It wasn't just a threat, it was a prophecy. He wasn't going to raid her home or drag her away in the night. He was going to wait. He was going to watch her. A spider watching a fly struggle in its web, waiting for the moment she finally, inevitably, broke. As the sun began to set, casting long, bloody fingers of light across the valley, Lena Bishop knew she was no longer just a widow. She was a prisoner on her own land. The days that followed bled into a week, then two. Each one was a masterclass in psychological torment. Nachok and his men were a constant, silent presence at the edge of her world. They never crossed the invisible line onto her immediate property, but their camp by the creek was a stark, living reminder of their purpose. She watched them through the grimy panes of her cabin window, her heart a frantic bird trapped against her ribs. They were not the lazy, whooping savages she'd read about in penny dreadfuls. There was a discipline to their camp, a quiet, unnerving order that unsettled her more than open aggression ever could. They tended their horses with care, cleaned their weapons with methodical precision, and spoke in low, guttural tones that the wind carried to her like whispers from a nightmare. Nachok himself was often visible. Sometimes he would sit motionless for hours, simply staring at her cabin, as if he could see through the log walls and into her very soul. Other times he would train with a bow, the raw power in his massive frame evident as he drew the string back, his muscles coiling like a panther's. The arrow would fly, impossibly fast, and strike a distant cottonwood tree with a solid thwack that made her jump every time. It was a message. This is my strength. This is my patience. This is my aim. Lena's life became a cramped, fearful routine. She did her chores with the Winchester always close at hand, its cold weight a poor comfort. Her eyes constantly scanned the cottonwood trees that lined the creek. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through her veins. Sleep was a luxury, coming only in short, fitful bursts filled with visions of his dark, unreadable eyes. Her supplies began to dwindle. The flour sack was nearly empty, and the salted pork was down to its last tough slab. A trip to Dust Devil Gulch was necessary, a journey of half a day that now seemed as perilous as crossing an ocean. What would they do when she left? Would they finally cross the line, burn her cabin to the ground? Or worse, would they follow her, trap her out in the open? The questions gnawed at her, but hunger was a more immediate tyrant. One morning, her resolve hardened by a gnawing ache in her belly, she hitched her weary old mule, Daisy, to the buckboard. With a shotgun loaded and lying on the seat beside her, she urged Daisy forward, her jaw set so tight it ached. As she passed the creek, she could feel their eyes on her, a dozen pairs of eyes watching her every move. She refused to look, keeping her gaze fixed on the dusty track ahead, her knuckles white on the reins. She expected them to give chase, to hear the thunder of hooves behind her. But there was only silence. The same screaming silence from before, only now it was filled with him. The trip to town was an agony of nerves. Every rock formation, every stand of mesquite seemed to be a potential ambush site. By the time the ramshackle buildings of Dust Devil Gulch came into view, her nerves were frayed raw. The town was a collection of dusty storefronts and false-fronted saloons, populated by weary prospectors, hardened cowboys, and suspicious townsfolk who looked at a lone woman with a mixture of pity and contempt. At the general store, the proprietor, a portly man named Peter Finch, eyed her nervously. "Heard you got some trouble out your way, Lena," he said, his voice low as he weighed a sack of flour. Word traveled fast in the desert. "I'm fine, Peter," she said, her voice tight. "Some folks saw smoke from an Apache camp near your claim," he pressed, his eyes darting toward the door. "Sheriff Porter ain't keen on riding out that way. Says it ain't county business, but we all know he's yellow." Her heart sank. She was truly on her own. The law wouldn't help her. Just as she was loading her meager supplies onto the buckboard, a man approached her, and he was the last man on earth she wanted to see, Corbin Wexler. Wexler was a rancher whose land bordered her own, a man who dressed in fine clothes that always seemed out of place in the dust, whose smile was always too slick, whose eyes were always too cold. He had made offers on her land before Frank died, and had renewed them with barely disguised impatience right after the funeral. "Mrs. Bishop," he said, tipping his hat. His cologne was a cloying, unnatural smell in the dry air. "A lady like yourself shouldn't be making this trip alone, especially with renegades about." "I can manage, Mr. Wexler," she replied coolly, not giving him an inch. "Nonsense," he insisted, his smile not reaching those cold eyes. "That land, it's too much for you. The water rights to that creek alone are valuable. I'd still be willing to take it off your hands. Give you a fair price. You could move into town. Be safe." The way he said safe made it sound like a threat. "The land is not for sale. It was my husband's," she said, the words tasting like ash. Wexler's smile tightened, a flicker of irritation crossing his face. "Your husband is dead, ma'am. Pride don't fill a belly or stop a bullet. You think on my offer." He sauntered away, leaving a trail of unease in his wake. As she watched him go, she saw him talking to Sheriff Porter over by the saloon. They were laughing. The sheriff clapped Wexler on the back. They were friends. A new cold dread washed over her. The sheriff wasn't just yellow, he was on Wexler's side. The ride home was just as tense, but when she arrived, the cabin was untouched. Her small flock of chickens was clucking in their coop, and nothing was out of place. Relief warred with a deep, unsettling confusion. Why were they just waiting? The next morning she found out. Lying by her woodpile was a freshly killed steer. It was one of Wexler's. She could see the Lazy W brand on its hide. It had been expertly butchered, cleaned, and dressed. A fortune in fresh meat. There were no tracks, no sign of who had left it. But she knew. It was him, not Chuck. She stared at the carcass for a long time, the shotgun heavy in her hands. This wasn't a gift. It was a move in a game she didn't understand. He wasn't just threatening her. He wasn't just providing for her. He was sending a message to Corbin Wexler, and he was declaring war, using her land as the battleground. He was showing her in his own silent, arrogant way that he could do what she couldn't. He could fight her enemies. He could sustain life. It was a terrifying form of courtship, a demonstration of his power and her dependence. And she realized with a jolt that he knew exactly who her real enemy was. He knew about Wexler. He knew more than he was letting on. The steer was too much. It was an act of allegiance she hadn't asked for, a brand that marked her as his. That night she made a decision. She couldn't stay. She couldn't be a pawn in this war. She had to run. She waited until the moon was hidden by clouds, until the camp by the creek was dark and silent. Packing a small bag with the last of her biscuits and a canteen of water, she crept out to the mule. Her hands shook as she saddled Daisy, every creak of the leather sounding like a gunshot in the night. She led the mule away from the cabin into the dark, unforgiving desert, choosing a path away from the main track, a path she hoped they wouldn't expect. The air was cold, the silence filled with the scuttling of unseen creatures. Every shadow looked like a warrior. Every gust of wind sounded like a whisper. She walked for what felt like hours, her heart hammering, convinced she had made it. She was free. And then, just as a sliver of hope began to warm her, a hand fell on her shoulder. She didn't scream. She couldn't. The sound was frozen in her throat. She turned slowly, her blood running cold. It was Nachok. He stood there, a towering silhouette against the faint starlight, as if he had grown out of the earth itself. He wasn't angry. His face was as unreadable as ever. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. He simply raised his arm and pointed back the way she had come, back toward her prison. Defeated, she turned and let him lead her back. He walked behind her, a silent, inescapable warden. Her one desperate bid for freedom had ended in utter failure. It proved what he had been showing her all along. There was no escape. Not from him. Not from this land. Her helplessness was absolute. The final straw came a week later. The breaking point wasn't a threat or a failed escape, but a simple mechanical failure. The pump for her well, a rickety contraption Frank had cobbled together from scrap, finally gave out with a sickening crunch of rusted metal. It was her only source of clean water besides the creek, and the creek was their territory. Despair, sharp and bitter, washed over her. This was the end. She couldn't fix it. She didn't have the tools, the strength, or the will. She sat on her porch that evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple, feeling utterly, completely defeated. When darkness fell, she went inside, too broken to even bar the door. What was the point? She woke just before dawn to a strange sound, a rhythmic clanging of metal on metal. Her heart hammered against her ribs. He was here. He had finally crossed the line. Peeking through the grimy window, she saw a figure at the well. It was Nachok. In the pale pre-dawn light, she could see the powerful muscles of his back and arms working as he manipulated the pump's broken handle. He had a few simple tools laid out beside him on a piece of leather. For over an hour she watched, hidden in the shadows of her own home, as the Giant Apache methodically and with surprising skill repaired her well pump. He didn't just patch it. He seemed to be re-engineering it, fashioning a new part from a piece of metal he'd brought with him. When he was finished, he worked the handle. The familiar, beautiful squeak was followed by a gush of clear, life-giving water. He drank from his cupped hands, then, without a single glance toward the cabin, walked back to his camp. Lena slowly, hesitantly, opened her door and approached the well. The repair was solid, the metal brace he'd fashioned stronger than the original part. She pumped the handle, and cool, clear water flowed freely. He was systematically dismantling her independence, piece by piece. He wasn't a jailer who kept her locked in. He was a warden who was slowly making the prison a better place to live. And that, she realized with a cold, sinking dread, was infinitely more dangerous. He wasn't just waiting for her to break. He was waiting for her to need him. The heat of late summer intensified, turning the valley into a furnace. The silent war of wills stretched on. Lena had taken to using the meat from the steer and the water from the repaired well. Small surrenders that tasted like ash in her mouth. She hated her reliance on him. Yet she couldn't deny the grim reality of her situation. Without his silent provisions, she would have failed already. The true breaking point came not from a man, but from the land itself. She was clearing brush from near the chicken coop, a thankless, sweaty task when she failed to see it, coiled in the shade of a sagebrush, a diamondback rattlesnake. She heard the dry, terrifying buzz an instant before it struck. A white-hot pain seared her calf. She screamed, a raw, primal sound of agony and terror, stumbling backward and falling hard into the dust. Panic, cold and absolute, seized her. She scrambled away, her eyes fixed on the snake as it slithered back into the undergrowth. Looking down, she saw the two small puncture marks on her leg, already beginning to swell and discolor. She knew what it meant. Out here alone, a bite like that was a death sentence. Tears streaming down her face, she half crawled, half limped back to the cabin, her leg throbbing with a venomous fire. She fumbled inside, collapsing onto the floorboards. She thought of Frank, of the promises they had made to build a life here. It was all ending in a dusty, ignominious heap. Suddenly the doorway was blocked, a giant silhouette against the blinding sun. It was Nachok. He must have heard her scream. He stepped inside, his eyes immediately finding her on the floor, then darting to her injured leg. For the first time, she saw something other than stoic certainty in his expression. It was a focused, sharp urgency. "Stay still," he commanded, his voice a blade. He knelt beside her, pulling a long, wicked-looking knife from a sheath on his belt. Lena flinched, dragging herself backward. "No, get away from me!" He ignored her, grabbing her ankle with a grip of iron that made her gasp. "The poison will reach your heart. You have little time." Without another word, he made two quick, shallow cuts over the bite marks, creating a small X. Before she could protest or even process what was happening, he lowered his head and put his mouth to the wound. Lena cried out, a mix of revulsion and sheer terror. He began to suck the venom from her flesh, spitting the poisoned blood onto the cabin's floorboards. The intimacy of the act was shocking, a violation as profound as the one he had vowed to commit. Yet it was an act to save her life. He worked for several minutes, his focus absolute, his powerful hands holding her legs steady. When he was done, he wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. He then rose and went to her fireplace, grabbing a handful of herbs from a pouch at his waist and mixing them with water from her bucket. He returned with a poultice of crushed green leaves and mud, which he packed firmly onto the wound. The strange mixture was surprisingly cool and soothing. Then, before she could object, he lifted her as easily as if she were a child and carried her to her bed. He laid her down gently, then stood back, watching her. Her head was spinning, her leg a dull, heavy ache. "You will be weak," he said. "You must sweat the poison out." He covered her with every blanket she owned, despite the stifling heat in the cabin. Then he sat in the single wooden chair in the corner of the room, his knife resting on his knee, and began his vigil. For 2 days he did not leave. He brought her water, forcing her to drink when she was too weak to lift her head. He changed the poultice on her leg, his touch firm but gentle. He sat in silence, a stoic guardian, while she drifted in and out of a feverish delirium. In her moments of lucidity, she would see him there, a solid, unmoving presence in the dim light, and a strange, terrifying sense of security would wash over her before the fever dragged her back under. On the third morning, the fever broke. She woke up drenched in sweat, weak and shaky, but her mind was clear for the first time in days. The swelling in her leg had gone down, and the terrible pain had subsided to a manageable throb. He was still there, in the chair, watching her. "Why?" she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. "Why did you save me?" He rose and came to the bedside, looking down at her. His face was impossible to read, a mask of stone. "A dead mother cannot bear a son." The brutal honesty of it should have angered her, but she was too weary, too raw. She had been so certain he was a monster, a creature of pure malice. But a monster would have let the snake finish its work. A monster wouldn't have patiently tended to her, keeping her alive through the worst of the fever. The man in her fever dreams had been a protector. The man in the chair was her captor. Which one was real? "My husband," she began, the words tasting strange. She needed to understand. "You said he killed your brother, Tasa." Nachok nodded slowly, his eyes holding hers. "There was a raid," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "Not by us. We were tracking the men who did it. Men on shod horses, white men. They raided a camp of the Chiricahua people. Old ones and women. They stole horses. We tracked them to this valley." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the quiet room. "Your husband was with them." Lena's world tilted on its axis. The floor seemed to drop out from under her. "No," she breathed. That's not possible. Frank, he wouldn't do that. He was a good man." "He was with them," Nachok repeated, his voice still flat, without judgment, a simple statement of fact. "We cornered them by the rocks to the south. There was a fight. Your husband was a good shot. He hit Taza from a great distance. We killed the others. But your husband, he got away. Wounded. He made it back here before he died." Suddenly, fragmented memories slotted into place with sickening clarity. Frank stumbling home late one night, claiming he'd been thrown from his horse, his feverish insistence that she tell no one he'd been gone, the small pouch of gold coins she'd found in his saddlebag, coins he claimed he'd won in a lucky poker game, the men he had been with lately, rough men, men from Wexler's ranch, Corbin Wexler, pride don't fill a belly or stop a bullet. It was Wexler, she breathed, the realization a punch to the gut. Frank was working for him. Wexler wanted this land, the water. He sent Frank with those men. She looked up at Nachok, her eyes wide with the horror of the truth. Frank hadn't been defending his home from savages. He'd been the savage. He'd been a raider, a horse thief, a killer. Her hatred for Nachok, the bedrock of her existence for months, crumbled into dust. It left behind a hollow, cavernous ache of shame and misplaced grief. She hadn't been mourning a hero. She had been mourning a man she didn't even know. My brother was young, Nachok said, and for the first time his voice was softer, tinged with a deep, resonant sadness. He had a wife, a child on the way. His life was stolen. Your husband's debt is real. Lena looked at the giant man before her, and she no longer saw a monster. She saw a man bound by grief and a code of honor she couldn't possibly comprehend. A man who had lost a brother just as she had lost a husband. Only her loss was a lie. His was real. The vow he had made no longer sounded like a simple threat of violence. It was something far more ancient, more complex. It was a terrible, unbreakable knot, tying their two shattered lives together. The truth settled over the small cabin like a shroud, heavy and suffocating. Everything Lena thought she knew about her life, her husband, and her place in this harsh land had been a lie. Frank, the man she had loved and grieved, had been a pawn in a rich man's cruel game. He had died a thief and a killer, and the man who had vowed to violate her was the only one who had told her the truth. Her recovery was slow. Nachok continued to care for her, his presence no longer a source of terror, but of a deeply unsettling comfort. He would hunt, leaving rabbits or quail on her doorstep. He spoke little, but when he did, it was to ask if she needed water or to tell her which herbs would help with the pain. A strange, unspoken truce formed between them, born from her medical crisis and his startling revelation. One afternoon, as she was sitting on the porch, her bandaged leg propped up on a stool, she saw riders approaching. It wasn't Nachok's warriors. It was Corbin Wexler and two of his hired guns. A cold knot of fear tightened in her stomach. Wexler reined in his horse, his eyes taking in her weakened state with predatory satisfaction. "Mrs. Bishop, I see you've had some trouble. A fall, perhaps?" "I'm fine, Mr. Wexler," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Are you?" he asked, his slick smile returning. "Because I hear different. I hear you've taken in a rather unusual house guest, the chief of the very band that's been terrorizing this valley." His words were a clear threat. He was painting her as a sympathizer, an outcast. In this part of the country, such an accusation could be a death sentence. "I don't know what you're talking about," she lied, her gaze unwavering. Wexler laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Don't play coy, Lena. We all know the Apache are camped on your creek, and we all know why they're here. Because of your husband. Frank was a fool. Got himself killed meddling in affairs that were too rich for his blood." He spat on the ground near her porch. "But his foolishness presents an opportunity." He leaned forward in his saddle, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "The army's been looking for an excuse to clear these hills. A white woman, living under the protection of a savage chief. That's just the excuse they need. They'll burn this whole valley to the ground to save you." He let that sink in. "Or," he continued, "you could be smart. Sign this land over to me. I'll tell the sheriff you were being held captive, that I bravely ran the Indians off. You walk away with a pocket full of cash, and I get what's mine. Everyone wins." "What's your?" she asked, her voice dripping with a contempt that surprised her. "This land was never yours." "This land has water," Wexler snapped, his facade of civility cracking. "And in this territory, whoever controls the water controls everything. Your husband understood that. He was willing to do what was necessary to get a piece of it." It was a confession, a casual, arrogant admission that he had sent Frank on the raid that cost Taza his life, and ultimately Frank's own. The last vestiges of Lena's old life burned away in a flash of pure, righteous anger. "You killed him," she said, her voice low and shaking with rage. "You sent him to do your dirty work, and you got him killed. Just like you got that Apache boy killed." Wexler shrugged, his face twisting into an ugly sneer. He knew the risks. "Now, are you going to be sensible, or do I have to be persuasive?" As if on cue, one of his men dismounted, a length of rope in his hand and a brutish grin on his face. They were going to force her. Before the man could take a single step onto the porch, a voice, deep and resonant, cut through the air like a knife. "She has given you her answer." Nechok emerged from the side of the cabin, moving with a silent, deadly speed that was terrifying to behold. He hadn't been in the camp. He had been close by, watching. In his hand he held a war axe, its polished stone head gleaming in the sun. Two of his warriors appeared behind him, materializing from the landscape as if from thin air, bows drawn, arrows aimed squarely at the chests of Wexler's men. Wexler's face went pale. His bravado evaporated in the face of the giant Apache leader. "This is between me and the woman, Chief," he stammered, his hand inching towards his pistol. "Her land is under my protection," Nechok stated calmly, his eyes locked on Wexler. "Her life is a debt owed to my people. You will not touch her. You will not touch this land. You will leave. Now." Wexler's man with the rope dropped it and scrambled back to his horse. The rancher's eyes darted between Nechok and his warriors, his mind calculating odds he clearly didn't like. "This isn't over," he snarled, pulling hard on his horse's reins. "I'll bring the law down on all of you. You'll hang for this, you and your savage-loving whore." He spurred his horse, and he and his men galloped away in a cloud of dust and impotent threats. Lena was breathing heavily, her hands clenched into fists. She looked at Nechok, who was still watching the riders retreat, his expression unreadable. He had defended her. He had claimed her and her land as his own, not just with a vow, but with a direct challenge to the white man who was her true enemy. "He'll be back," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "He'll bring more men. Or the army." Nechok turned to her, his dark eyes meeting hers. "Let him come," he said simply. "This land has now seen the blood of my brother and the blood of my enemy. We will not surrender it." In that moment, the line between captor and captive, between enemy and ally, blurred into nothingness. They were two people from different worlds, bound together by a tapestry of death, debt, and deception, and they were facing a common enemy who would see them both destroyed. The vow, made in the summer sun, was no longer a future sentence. It was a present reality. Her survival was now intrinsically linked to his, and his honor was tied to her protection. As the punishing heat of summer gave way to the crisp, golden days of autumn, a profound shift occurred on the small homestead. The dynamic, once defined by fear and dominance, slowly transformed into a partnership forged in shared necessity. Wexler's threat loomed over them, a storm gathering on the horizon, and the coming winter was a challenge they could only meet together. The Apache camp by the creek became a more permanent fixture. The warriors who had once been menacing statues were now figures of purpose. Under Nechok's direction, they began to help prepare the homestead for the harsh months ahead. Lena would watch from her porch as they, with an efficiency that amazed her, rethatched the leaky roof of her barn, their movements economical and sure. They helped her harvest the last of the meager corn crop, their calloused hands working alongside hers in the dusty field. Language was a barrier, but not an insurmountable one. Through a combination of gestures, Nechok's clipped English, and the few Apache words she began to pick up, a unique form of communication developed. She learned the names of his most trusted warriors: Geronimo, a wiry older man with eyes that held a hint of humor, and Cochise, a young, intense brave who moved with the grace of a hunting cat. They in turn began to call her by a name she didn't understand at first, Ishkai-Ne, which Nechok later explained meant woman of the house. The days fell into a rhythm. Lena would cook, making large stews from the game the men brought in, adding her own dwindling supply of beans and potatoes. She found herself cooking not just for one, but for a dozen, the simmering pot on her stove, a symbol of their strange, blended household. In the evenings, they would sometimes sit around a shared fire. The Apache men would speak softly in their own tongue, their voices a melodic counterpoint to the chirping of crickets. It was during these quiet moments that the walls between Lena and Nachok truly began to crumble. She would ask him about his people, their customs, their beliefs. He, in turn, would ask about her world, about the strange ways of the white settlers, their obsession with paper money and drawing lines on the land. One evening, as they sat by the fire, she found the courage to ask about the single eagle feather in his hair. He touched it gently, his large hand surprisingly delicate. It was a gift from my wife, Nalin. It was the first time he had ever mentioned a wife. Lena's heart gave a strange, unexpected pang. "Where is she?" she asked softly. He stared into the flames, his face a mask of old, deep sorrow. "She and our son, they were at a winter camp near the Gila River. Soldiers came. They said they were looking for warriors who had raided a freight wagon. But there were no warriors in the camp, only women, children, and old men." His voice grew thick, heavy. "It did not matter. They burned the camp." He fell silent, but his fists were clenched so tightly his knuckles were white. Lena's breath caught in her throat. He was a widower, too. He hadn't just lost a wife. He had lost his entire family, not to a fight between warriors, but to a massacre. He was a mirror of her own loss, but his grief was vaster, more violent than anything she had ever imagined. She saw now that his desire for a son wasn't just about fulfilling a blood debt for his brother. It was about reclaiming a future that had been burned to ashes. It was about planting a new seed of life in scorched, blood-soaked earth. "I'm sorry," she whispered, the words feeling pitifully inadequate. He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw not a chief or a warrior, but simply a man hollowed out by grief. "Sorrow is a river that all people must cross," he said, his voice heavy. "It has drowned many." She told him about Frank then, not the lie she had clung to for so long, but the truth. She told him about their dreams of building a life, of having children who would run through this valley. She spoke of his easy laugh and the way he held her, and then of her shame and anger at his betrayal and weakness. Nachok listened without interruption, his gaze steady and patient. When she was finished, her voice choked with tears. He simply nodded. "He was a man caught between his dreams and his weakness," he said, his words a balm on her raw soul. "Many men die in that place. An understanding passed between them, deeper than any words. They were two survivors scarred by the same brutal land, their hearts holding the ghosts of those they had lost. The physical space between them also shrank." He began taking his evening meal on her porch instead of at the main campfire. She would bring him a plate, and they would sit in a comfortable silence as the stars emerged in the vast velvet sky. She noticed the small things about him, the way his eyes crinkled slightly at the corners when he was listening intently, the sheer size of his hands and how gently he could handle a delicate object, the deep timbre of his voice when he would occasionally hum a low, ancient-sounding melody. The fear she once felt had long since vanished, replaced by a profound and unsettling respect. And beneath that respect, something else was beginning to take root. Something warm and dangerous and utterly confusing. When he looked at her now, she no longer saw a threat. She saw a future. A terrifying, impossible future that she was no longer sure she wanted to resist. The vow, once a sentence of violation, now echoed in her mind with a different resonance. It was no longer about his justice. It was about their shared survival, about the creation of something new from the wreckage of both their pasts. The first snows were not far off, and with them, winter. And for the first time, Lena Bishop was not afraid. The first snowflakes fell on a grim, gray morning in late November. Fat, wet flakes that melted into the dust but promised more to come. The air had a sharp, metallic bite to it, the kind that heralded the true beginning of winter. The homestead was as ready as it could be. The barn was stocked with fodder, the cabin's gaps were chinked with fresh mud, and firewood was stacked high against the walls. A sense of tense anticipation hung over the valley. They were all waiting for Corbin Wexler to make his move. He came at dawn, 2 days later. The attack was not subtle. Wexler rode at the head of nearly 20 men, a small army of hired guns and disgruntled ranch hands he'd likely plied with whiskey and promises of Apache gold. They came from the east, using the rising sun to their advantage, their rifles glinting. But Nachuk had been expecting them. His warriors were not caught sleeping. They were already positioned, hidden among the rocks and brush that dotted the landscape around the cabin. A silent, deadly reception committee. The first volley of arrows took Wexler's men by complete surprise. Two riders toppled from their saddles before a single shot had even been fired. Chaos erupted. Shouts and curses tore through the morning quiet, followed by the deafening roar of rifles. Lena was inside the cabin, her heart pounding against her ribs like a war drum. Frank's Winchester was in her hands, its stock smooth and familiar. Beside her, by the other window, was Geronimo, the older warrior. Nachuk had insisted two of his men stay to protect the cabin, to protect her. Bullets splintered the log walls and shattered the window panes. Lena flinched but held her position. She saw one of Wexler's men trying to use the woodpile for cover. Taking a deep breath to steady her hands, she sighted down the barrel just as Frank had taught her and squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, and the man screamed, clutching his leg as he fell. A grim satisfaction, cold and hard, settled in her. This was her home. She would not let them take it. The battle raged for over an hour. It was a brutal, swirling affair. Wexler's men had numbers and firearms, but Nachuk's warriors had knowledge of the terrain, unparalleled stealth, and a cold, disciplined fury. She saw Nachuk moving through the fray, a giant among men. He seemed to be everywhere at once, his war axe a blur of motion, his powerful form a rallying point for his warriors. He fought not with wild abandon, but with a focused, intelligent lethality that was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. From her vantage point, Lena could see the tide of the battle turning. Wexler's men were disorganized, their initial charge broken. They were being outmaneuvered and picked off one by one. Then she saw Wexler himself, his face a mask of rage and desperation. He had dismounted and was leading a small group in a direct charge toward the cabin. He knew if he could take the house, he would have a fortified position. "They are coming for the house," Geronimo grunted, loosing an arrow that sent one of the charging men stumbling. The men reached the porch. The door burst inward with a splintering crash. Lena fired the Winchester at the first man through, the blast deafening in the enclosed space. He fell backward, but two more were right behind him. Geronimo met them with his knife, a whirlwind of desperate courage. Lena scrambled back, trying to reload, her fingers clumsy with adrenaline. One of Wexler's men lunged for her, his face contorted in a vicious snarl. She swung the heavy rifle like a club, catching him in the side of the head. He staggered back, his eyes still fixed on her. Suddenly, the doorway was filled by Nachuk. He was wounded, a bloody gash on his arm, but his eyes burned with a primal fire. He swept the man attacking Lena aside with a single powerful blow from his axe handle, sending him crashing into a table. Then Wexler was there. Pushing past his own man, his pistol aimed directly at Nachuk's chest. "It's over, you savage!" Wexler screamed, his voice cracking with a mix of triumph and terror. Everything seemed to happen in slow motion. Nachuk was too close to dodge, his axe out of position. Geronimo was still struggling with the other man. Lena, her rifle empty, saw Wexler's finger tighten on the trigger. Without thinking, she lunged. She threw herself not at Wexler, but at Nachuk, shoving his massive frame with all her might. Her momentum, combined with his surprise, sent them both tumbling to the floor, just as Wexler's pistol roared. The bullet meant for Nachuk's heart tore through the fleshy part of his shoulder instead. Nachuk grunted in pain, but he rolled with the fall, coming up onto one knee. Before Wexler could fire again, Nachuk threw his war axe. It spun end over end, the stone head striking Wexler squarely in the chest with a sickening, final thud. The rancher's eyes went wide with shock, the pistol falling from his lifeless fingers as he crumpled to the ground. The fight was over. The remaining few of Wexler's men, seeing their leader fall, broke and fled. Silence descended, broken only by the moans of the wounded and the rising wind, which now carried the snow in thick, swirling sheets. The cabin was a wreck. The floor was stained with blood. Wexler's, his men's, and Nachuk's. Lena rushed to Nachok's side. He was leaning against the wall, his face pale beneath its copper hue. "You are hurt," she said, her hands hovering over the bullet wound in his shoulder. He looked at her, his dark eyes searching her face. "You saved my life." "You saved mine," she replied, her voice trembling. She tore a strip from her petticoat and pressed it firmly against the wound, trying to staunch the bleeding. Their faces were inches apart. The smell of sweat, blood, and gunpowder filled the air. The battle for the land was over. But in that moment, looking into his eyes, Lena realized another battle. The one inside her own heart had also just been decided. He had vowed to take her, to claim her as payment for a debt. But here, in the bloody aftermath of a shared fight for survival, she understood the truth. He had not taken anything. Instead, he and this brutal, beautiful land had captured her heart. The choice was no longer his to make. It was hers, and she had already made it. The snow fell for 3 days, a thick, silent blanket that covered the scars of the battle and transformed the valley into a pristine white wilderness. It buried the bodies of Wexler and his men, entombing the hatred and greed that had brought them there, and isolated the small homestead from the rest of the world. Inside the cabin, a new world was being born. Lena cleaned and stitched Nachok's wounds, her hands surprisingly steady. The bullet had gone clean through his shoulder, and while painful, it had missed the bone. As she worked, he sat stoically, his gaze never leaving her face, a silent testament to a trust that had been forged in bloodshed. His warriors, having tended to their own, kept a respectful distance, their quiet vigil a sign of their loyalty to their chief and their acceptance of her new role. They were snowbound. The pass leading to Dust Devil Gulch would be impassable for months. They were alone together, a small island of humanity in a vast frozen sea. The cabin, once a symbol of Lena's lonely grief, became a haven of warmth and life. The air was filled with the smell of wood smoke, simmering stew, and the herbal medicines Geronimo prepared for the wounded. The rigid lines that had separated them, white woman and Apache chief, captive and captor, had been erased by the shared fight for their lives. They were simply a man and a woman, their past littered with ghosts, their future an unwritten page. On the fourth night, after the last of the wounded had been settled and a quiet peace had fallen over the cabin, Lena found Nachok standing by the window, looking out at the moonlit snow. His arm was in a sling she had fashioned, but he stood tall and strong, a silhouette of enduring power. "The winter is here," he said, his voice a low rumble that filled the quiet room. "Yes," she replied, coming to stand beside him. The cold from the glass pane kissed her cheek. "We're safe now, for a while." He turned to face her. In the soft glow of the lantern, the hard lines of his face seemed to soften. His eyes, which had held so much sorrow and severity, now held a question. "The vow I made," he began, his voice hesitant for the first time she could remember. "It was made in anger and grief. It was the way of my people, a law of blood for blood. I did not understand. I did not know the woman I was speaking to." Lena's heart beat a steady rhythm, no longer in fear, but in anticipation. "And now?" she prompted softly. "Now," he said, reaching out with his good hand to gently touch her cheek, his calloused fingers surprisingly tender against her skin. "Now I would not hold you to a vow made in honor of the dead. I would ask you for a promise in honor of the living." He looked around the small, warm cabin, at the life they had fought to protect. "This is your home, but you have made it a home for my people as well. You have shown a courage I have not seen in many warriors. You saved my life. The debt is gone, Lena. You are free to choose." He was offering her an escape, a release from the prophecy he had laid upon her months ago. He was giving her a choice, the one thing she thought she'd lost forever. And in that choice, she found her answer. "I was never free," she said, her voice clear and strong. "I was a prisoner of grief, a prisoner of a lie. You, you set me free, Nachok." She leaned into his touch, her hand coming up to cover his. "What you vowed in anger, I now choose in hope. I do not want to be the payment for a debt. I want to be the wife of the man who stood with me, who fought for me. I want to build a new life here, with you." A slow smile spread across his face, a rare and beautiful thing that transformed his severe features. It was a smile of relief, of joy, and of a future finally within reach. He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion or dominance, but one of profound tenderness and respect. It was a silent seal on a new vow, a promise made not under the brutal sun of summer, but in the quiet, hopeful sanctuary of a winter's night. As the snow continued to fall, blanketing the land in a deep and cleansing peace, Lena knew that the giant Apache's vow would come true. By winter's end, she would indeed carry his son. But it would not be the result of a savage's justice. It would be the beginning of a new bloodline, a new family born not from vengeance, but from a love as fierce and resilient as the land itself. The story of Lena and Nachok is more than just a tale of the Old West. It's a testament to the human spirit's ability to find understanding in the face of hatred and love in the most unexpected of places. It reminds us that our true enemies are often not those who look different, but those whose hearts are filled with greed and prejudice. Theirs was a love forged in fire, sealed in snow, and destined to create a future that would bridge two worlds. If this story of unlikely love, survival, and the breaking of barriers resonated with you, please take a moment to support our channel. Hit that like button to let us know you enjoyed it, and share this video with someone who appreciates a powerful story. Most importantly, if you haven't already, please subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss our next journey into the dramatic heart of history. Thank you for watching.